Francesca Happe, que ella es catedrática en neurociencia cognitiva en el Centro de Investigación Genética, Social y del Desarrollo del MRC en el Instituto de Psiquiatría King's College Hospital. Nadie mejor que ella representa cuál es el motivo de este centro con la integración de la investigación que ella hace en investigación cognitiva social, genética y en neuroimagen. Yo recuerdo cuando estaba en Londres que Francesca hacía su doctorado con Jutta Fritz y ya entonces se hablaba de esa brillante estudiante de doctorado que estaba con Jutta. Y ayer ella nos comentaba que ella seguía obsesionada con la investigación de trastornos del espectro autista. Durante estos años su investigación ha sido altamente prolífica en todas las áreas, yo creo que del área de la cognitiva social, de trastornos del espectro autista, en teoría de la mente, en funciones ejecutivas, en la teoría de coherencia central, que ella también comenzó con Jutta Fritz, y en miles de áreas. Sabemos todos que ella no suele viajar, que tiene responsabilidades familiares importantes y por eso es un gran lujo tenerla hoy aquí para hablarnos de sus últimas investigaciones en el campo de la investigación cognitiva social.
Well, thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here in Spain, which is one of my absolutely favorite countries, and it's a great privilege to be invited to talk to you about our research. I am still obsessed by autism and Asperger syndrome, and delighted to talk to you about it. Now, I brought enough material for an hour and a half, but I'm only going to speak, I think, now for an hour, so excuse me if I go fast over some slides. If you want to know more, please just come and talk to me afterwards or ask questions. So I think I can be very brief in going over the basics of the diagnosis and description because of the wonderful talks we've already had today. I'm going to introduce the idea that the three core features of Asperger syndrome and autism can in fact be separated out, and that may be a more useful way to study them. And then I'll spend most of the talk giving you our latest research on cognitive accounts in terms of understanding why people on the autism spectrum and people with Asperger syndrome find it so difficult to know what's going on in somebody else's mind and yet have such remarkable abilities in non-social areas. I'll say probably rather little about the brain. We'll see how time goes, and I'll finish with some suggestions. I think we know now the facts behind the autism spectrum disorders. We know that Asperger disorder is one among a set of pervasive developmental disorders in the current diagnostic schedules, and that there's some controversy over whether Asperger syndrome is different from high-functioning autism. And we've heard about the challenge of diagnosing an individual for the first time in adulthood, where you may not be able to get him information about the early life history if the parents are no longer alive, for example, if you're diagnosing a 50 or 60-year-old. I think the current consensus from the research is that Asperger syndrome is part of the autistic spectrum. But as Rita said, to talk about Asperger syndrome as mild autism is very misleading. There are probably many cases of Asperger syndrome that are never diagnosed. So although the incidence of Asperger syndrome may be relatively small, there are probably many more people who never come to clinical attention. And a key question for us is what makes the difference between good and poor outcome for these individuals. The individual who is a statistics professor and manages well versus the individual who develops depression and severe anxiety and ends up needing a lot of clinical care. So, to return to the triad, Asperger syndrome, like autism, is diagnosed on the basis of social difficulties, communication impairments, and Rita has very clearly described how communication is different from language, and a person with Asperger syndrome can have wonderful language, but very poor communication. And the third part of the triad are the restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests, which in a young child might be flapping or lining objects up in exactly the same order each time, but in an adult with Asperger's syndrome might be collecting the Latin names of every type of carrot, the numbers on lampposts in Britain, bus timetables, or astronomy, or higher mathematics. We've explored the coherence of this triad, and I'm going to skip over the work to give you the bottom line. Our work looking at the general population has suggested that how good you are in your social skills, how good you are or poor you are in communicating, and how rigid and repetitive you are only quite loosely connected. And that indeed you can find individuals who have severe social difficulties but don't show restricted and repetitive behavior of the autistic type. And you can show individuals who have restricted, rigid behavior but don't have social difficulties. And this suggests to us, and our twin work suggests to us, that these different parts of autism and Asperger's syndrome have rather different etiological roots, that different genetic factors are at work and probably different environmental factors. One important question is what happens to the individuals who only have one part of that triad? What diagnosis, if any, do they get? What help do they get? The different parts of autism, the different parts of Asperger's syndrome may need different explanations and may need different interventions. And I'm going to suggest, too, that they may need different cognitive theories to explain them well. I think that the field of research of psychological theories to understand the mind in autism has not succeeded in producing one grand theory that can explain all parts of Asperger's syndrome. But we do have a number of theories that are good at explaining and describing and predicting the difficulties in one or two of these areas. So I'll talk about theory of mind and social cognitive theories. I'll talk about problems in executive functions, and I'll talk about the idea that, in part, Asperger's syndrome is a different psychological style rather than a psychological deficit. To begin with theory of mind, I think by now you all know this term, theory of mind, and it refers not to some philosophical theory, but to the very intuitive ability to recognize what somebody else might be thinking, to realizing intuitively that you might not know something that I know. And this is at the basis of communication and of successful social interaction. So very simple tests like the Sally Ann task, which are artificial, can pick up and illustrate clearly how even a bright individual on the autism spectrum at the age of 8 or 9 may not understand something that a neurotypical, an ordinary 3-year-old understands. So that, for example, that Sally doesn't know that her ball has been moved. So problems with reading other minds has been a very useful theory. It explains that we should think about Asperger's syndrome and autism not as a lack of interest in the social world, as a lack of sociability, but instead as a problem in a specific social skill, the ability to read other minds. It explains why even an individual who has a lot of language may be over-literal because they're not reading the thoughts behind the words. And it explains why pretend play, which is all about how things are in your head rather than how they are in the real world, remains puzzling to most individuals with Asperger's syndrome, certainly in their early years. But when we talk about Asperger's syndrome, as opposed to classic autism, we have to recognize that many people with Asperger's syndrome do pass simple tests of theory of mind, and many of them appear to develop the ability to recognize other people's thoughts, but perhaps with a significant and damaging delay. So a key question for us is, Why can it be that an individual comes into our laboratory, he has Asperger's syndrome, he has a great deal of difficulty in everyday life, but when we give him simple tests, he seems to be able to pass, he seems to understand? Well, there are a number of possibilities. Of course, our simple experimental tests are not like real life. They're slow and they're simple. And in real life, things move very fast. Many people with Asperger's syndrome will say, if I could just slow the world down, I would be okay. I could cope with social interaction. Or if I could run the video of life again a few times, then I would get it. But by the time I've worked it out, it's gone already and it's too late. So could it be that that's important? I want to just show you a little short movie that illustrates one of the ways we've been looking at social understanding. So when you watch this little film, you hopefully get a sense that these triangles are interacting, that they have intentions. And even though you can't see any faces, any eyes, you get a sense that they want different things. And even perhaps that one triangle can be fooling another triangle. So these simple sorts of tasks often show up social difficulties in Asperger's syndrome that are not shown by little story tasks or situations that are close to real life, where the person with Asperger's syndrome can use all of their verbal skills and their good memory to cover up their real difficulties. But these sorts of animations, whereas an ordinary person, even an ordinary child, will say, oh, the little one's trying to trick the big one. The little one pretends to be sad so he can escape. The person with Asperger's syndrome will often say, well, the large red triangle moved 3 centimeters to the left, and then the blue triangle moved at a right angle for 45 seconds, and so on and so on. It's all very literal. But the other possibility that I think we have to take seriously is that the real difficulty in Asperger's syndrome is to do with a delay in coming to read minds. And that may have a lot to do with what Amy Klin described so beautifully earlier on, that from early days, people on the autism spectrum are not becoming experts in the social world by paying special attention to the important cues like the eyes and the face, and that instead they're distracted by other parts of the world. So I want to talk for just a few minutes about how reading other minds is important in development, and how if a young child isn't reading other minds, can't tell what somebody else is thinking, that's going to change the course of their development. So from very early on, as Amy described, young, typically developing children are interested in what other people are interested in. We know this even as adults, because if you walk down the street and everyone's staring up, pointing at something, you can't help but look up too. We can't help it, because we're social beings. So we learn to be interested in what other people tell us is important by their behavior. And we imitate what others do just to communicate and to play with them. But that's very different in Asperger's syndrome. So here at the top you see a neurotypical child. He's looking around to check if what he's doing is okay. What does his mum think? He wants to find out. And that's a very important part of typical development. We don't have a choice. We always are tuned to others' feelings. We want to seek information from others. But below you see a child maybe with Asperger's syndrome. He's not interested in what his mother thinks about what he's doing. He's interested in what he's doing because it interests him. And we know that young people on the autism spectrum look less at faces, that they're less motivated by social rewards. Saying to a young school child with Asperger's syndrome, well done, I'm so proud of you, will often leave them puzzled. Why would you be proud of me? What's it got to do with you? But if you tell them, you did very well, what you did was very intelligent, then that makes sense. That's a logical comment. And so it makes sense that for a young child who's not reading minds, they may fail to acquire knowledge and skills in the normal social way. And what Rita said earlier about not equating intelligence with social understanding is absolutely key here, I think, because people with Asperger syndrome who are highly intelligent often fail to acquire knowledge that the rest of us acquire socially, that even somebody who's not very intelligent but is neurotypical will acquire socially. And I think particularly of an adult I knew who was very, very bright, but he was told by his workmates that he should use deodorant. And so he went and bought some deodorant, and he sprayed it on his face because he felt that it was his face that got hot and got sweaty. And he thought, this is what deodorant's for, and he sprayed it on his face. Who ever taught you what to do with deodorant? No teacher ever taught you that. You just absorbed it socially from being around other people. You just take in this information without thinking about it. And people on the autism spectrum don't absorb this information socially. Some work that my student and colleague Naomi Fisher did also suggests that when people on the Asperger syndrome do come to read other minds late in life, it may be a double-edged sword. It may bring some difficulties as well as some benefits. So what she found was that those Asperger adults who were good at theory of mind tasks were more anxious and slightly more depressed than those Asperger adults who did badly on theory of mind tasks. And this fits perhaps with something you may have seen in your interactions with people with Asperger syndrome, that sometimes a child with Asperger syndrome who is mind blind, who is unaware initially that his schoolmates are making fun of him perhaps, or are manipulating him to get into trouble, will then, maybe in his teenage years, switch from mind blindness to paranoia. He becomes aware that sometimes people have nasty intentions towards him, but he overgeneralizes that. So now he thinks that everybody has a nasty intention towards him. You can see how a late developed mind reading, and perhaps a fragile mind reading, could cause more anxiety as you compare yourself to others, as you suspect others' motivations. I want to make a distinction between reading other people's thoughts and caring about other people's feelings. Hans Asperger originally used the term autistic psychopathy for his group of children that he described. And in the current diagnostic schemes, psychopathic disorder refers to individuals who are callous and unemotional and typically hurt others for their own gain without caring about the hurt that they cause. And sometimes I'm asked whether Asperger syndrome has anything to do with psychopathy, with this antisocial sort of personality. And I want to make a very clear distinction between the two, because research has shown that people with autism and Asperger syndrome may find it difficult to recognize what somebody else is thinking or feeling, but they do care about other people's feelings. So to the extent that they know what you're feeling, they will care about it. They will have sympathy for you. Whereas somebody who is a psychopath is typically very good at reading other minds. He's good at knowing that he's making you hurt, he's making you upset, but he doesn't care. I want to keep those two very separate. Our research does suggest that sometimes, very rarely, you can have both problems together. So an individual with Asperger syndrome may also have a problem in empathy, in caring about others' feelings. And when you get those two together, I think it's very dangerous. And if I say that these are the individuals who are chilling, who make you feel scared, then perhaps if any of you have met such individuals, you know that's not most of Asperger syndrome. People with Asperger syndrome can be challenging, They can be sometimes very upsetting, they can be fascinating and endearing, but they're not typically chilling. And I want to urge you that if you have a child or an adult that you work with who harms animals, who harms other people, and doesn't seem to care about it, understanding that you have to talk to them properly about it, not just look at their faces, but really doesn't care about the effects of what they do on others, don't think this is just part of Asperger's syndrome. This is something extra that needs an extra intervention. I want to say a little bit about reading your own mind. We've heard earlier in the day about not only not knowing what others are thinking and feeling, but maybe in Asperger's syndrome having difficulty knowing what you yourself are thinking and feeling, knowing yourself. And this is an area that we're just researching at the moment. We started with the anecdotal evidence that people like Donna Williams and others will say that, for example, she says, autism lets me speak my own words without knowing what I'm saying or even thinking. This feeling that reading their own minds is also difficult. And we know from studies that alexithymia, the difficulty of describing your feelings, is also very common in Asperger's syndrome. There are a number of studies now that suggest that knowing, for example, whether you know something or are merely guessing is a difficult distinction to make for people on the autism spectrum. Having problems reading your own mind will also have developmental effects. It'll, again, change the course of your development. It may have something to do with the executive problems, the problems in planning ahead. Because when we know that we're facing a new situation or a difficult situation, we often plan it in our heads imaginatively. We think through the steps of what might happen. And if people with Asperger's syndrome find it harder to reflect on their own thoughts, this may be difficult for them. It may explain why emotions can get confused, why you can have a young man who is weeping but saying that he's angry. It may explain why memory can be peculiar in Asperger's syndrome. And there's some good evidence coming out now that episodic memory, memory for your own life events, may be very different in Asperger's syndrome and may be remembered more as if they were facts that you learnt rather than things you experienced. And it may also explain some areas of talent, and I'll come back to that later. It suggests that we need to think about external aids, scaffolding, for thinking about your own thoughts. And I know some teenagers with Asperger's syndrome who have begun only at 13 or 14 that at night time or in the evening they want to talk out loud about what happened during the day, just to themselves. Or they find it helpful to keep a diary, to put their thoughts down on paper so they can reflect on them, as if it's hard to just do that in their own heads. I think I'll skip the ways that not reading minds may make people with Asperger's syndrome more talented, but I'm very happy to talk about that if people want to ask questions. So let's move on to the non-social aspects of autism. The idea that people with autism have difficulty, and people with Asperger's syndrome, despite their high intelligence, have great difficulty in planning and monitoring their behavior, in being flexible in new situations, and in generating new ideas, and instead fall back very much on habit, as Rita described. This has been covered by the term executive dysfunction, problems in executive function. And this is a very general term that covers all sorts of flexible behaviors that are determined by the frontal lobes, the parts that are particularly big in the human brain rather than in other animals' brains. And people noticed that there were parallels between the problems that people with frontal lobe damage have after, for example, a car crash, and the problems that can be seen in autism or Asperger's syndrome, being stuck in a particular behavior, being unable to plan ahead to choose the right course of action. And this can be tested in a number of ways. The Tower of London test, many of you may know, the task is to move the balls from their original position to the final position that's shown to the person on a card in as few moves as possible. But each ball has to stay on a peg. So you can see that if you just think, well, the red ball has to move to the last peg, then you're going to put it in the wrong position and you're going to get into a mess because it's then stuck underneath. So you have to plan ahead in order to do this effectively. And the Wisconsin card sorting test is, again, a test many of you will know, a test of flexibility. You have to sort each card onto one of the piles. Maybe you start by sorting by number or color or shape. And then the rule will change, and now instead of being told correct, 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 you're told you're wrong for that particular sorting. And you have to change to a new way of sorting. And that can be very difficult for somebody on the autism spectrum. So we know that this is a good description of many of the difficulties that people with Asperger's syndrome face. And these difficulties are very important in everyday adaptation, especially in adulthood. And I think they're at the root of why many adults with very high IQ fail to live independently, for example, because they get stuck in a particular behavior or because they can't plan ahead. But we also know that these problems aren't specific to Asperger's syndrome. They're seen, for example, in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. And it's not clear if these are present from very early on in life or emerging later, but they require help for sure. We've done some work comparing the specific profile of difficulties in Asperger's syndrome and high-functioning autism compared to ADHD. And our study, at least, suggests that with age, these difficulties are lessening. The people with autism are getting somewhat better as they get older, comparing a young and old group. It's not a longitudinal study. Whereas the ADHD group are showing much less improvement with age. So that gives us some hope. And we've also tried to train people with high-functioning autism or Asperger's syndrome to be more flexible. And this was work again by Naomi Fisher. And she trained one group on theory of mind type tasks. She trained another group on executive function and specifically on flexibility of thought. And she used the metaphor, a bit like the toolbox, used a metaphor of a machine like a digger that can have a lot of different attachments. And you use different attachments for different things. When it's digging, it uses this attachment. When it's lifting, it uses a different attachment. And then she said to the children further on in the training, your mind, your brain is just the same. It needs to use different tools for different jobs. And sometimes when you've been using one tool for a long time, it gets sticky and it's hard to take that tool off and put on your new brain tool. And she tried to make it very concrete and she did a lovely job. What we found was that you could really improve cognitive flexibility in the training, but it didn't generalize outside the training because although the children had all these strategies, they didn't know when to use them. So we need to add something extra. But what was interesting was that the children who were trained to be more flexible in thinking about their own thinking became better after the training was over at theory of mind and at thinking about other people's thoughts. So this is interesting, again, I think, about how knowing your own mind is important in interacting with other minds. So the third cognitive account I want to talk about is really addressing what neither theory of mind nor executive function can answer or explain. It's been known for a long time that when you give intelligence tests to people on the autism spectrum, even those who have low IQ, the profile is very uneven. Some tests are much better than you would expect, other tests are much include savant skills, like Stephen Wiltshire's amazing ability to draw from memory, for example, the cityscape of Tokyo, having flown over it in a helicopter only once for a matter of minutes. But they also include the much more widespread good memory for facts, particularly facts in your own area of interest. Ability to do jigsaw puzzles or other mechanical skills that are very common. And in many cases, people on the autism spectrum have a special ability, but it may not be recognized as such. So if you have a young person who gets very distressed when they walk into a familiar room and an ornament on the mantelpiece has moved just an inch, and they notice it straight away and get very, very upset and distressed, you may not think that you have someone with an amazing skill. You may just think this is an amazing problem. But of course, that person can do something that you and I can't do. They can notice tiny changes in their environment that we would be blind to, like the young girl that Amy described, noticing the sweet in the corner of the room. This detail focus has been described by Kanner already, who talked about the inability to experience wholes without full attention to the constituent parts. And he says, a situation, a performance, a sentence is not regarded as complete if it's not made up of exactly the same elements that were present at the time the child was first confronted with it. If the slightest ingredient is altered or removed, the total situation is no longer the same and therefore is not accepted as such. And you can imagine how, if something has to be exactly as you saw it before, to be recognized as familiar, the world is going to be terrifying. You are going to be anxious a lot of the time because you can't find familiarity and safety by matching things partly to something you know. The National Autistic Society in Britain had a very nice poster that conveyed this detail focus. And I know you can't read it. I'll try and read or reconstruct for you what the poster says. It says, when a person with autism walks into a room, the first thing they see is a pillow with a coffee stain shaped like Africa, a train ticket sticking out of a magazine, 25 floorboards, a remote control, a paperclip on the mantelpiece, a marble under the chair, a crack in the ceiling, and it goes down and down and down, and then it says, so it's not surprising that they ignore you completely. So the extraordinary eye for detail in autism and Asperger syndrome causes problems because it can be an enormous distraction, but it also can be a source of abilities and assets. And probably most of us in this room don't have that ability to, for example, spot the differences in this picture. But many people with Asperger syndrome can see straight away what's different. So this has led to the idea of a different psychological style, a different approach to the world, which has been referred to as weak-centric coherence or detail focus. And Uta Frith was the first person to talk about this and to point out that neurotypicals like us are really not very good at details. And that when, for example, you leave the Congress today, you may remember the gist, the core information that people were talking about, but you're very unlikely to remember the exact words that any of us used. We all know people with autism or Asperger syndrome who are exactly the opposite. They would leave being able to repeat back long phrases, word for word perfect, but they would have missed the real message that we're trying to convey. And so we've been exploring this detail focus now for a number of years, and we've come to think that this is really not any kind of deficit, but is a cognitive, a psychological style. The anecdote that really made me take this idea of detail focus very seriously came from Lorna Wing, who described to me how she had been assessing a young man with autism spectrum disorder, and she got out various little objects for the assessment and asked him to name them, and he named the toy doll and the toy bed and the quilt. And then she pointed to the pillow and said, "And what's this?" And he said, "It's a piece of ravioli." And what was nice about this anecdote is that it's not that the boy was wrong. Lorna Wing said when she looked at the pillow, yes, it looked just like a piece of ravioli. But she would never have been able to see that resemblance because the context made her see it in a particular way. So it's not that there's wrong perception, but that there's perception that is free of the distracting context and focuses in on one part. And this can make you very good at several tasks. For example, the embedded figures test, where, as many of you will know, your job is to find the simple small shape within the complex larger shape. And I've given this task to young people with severe autism, without any language, with low measured IQ, and they can spot the part as fast as I can put the pictures down on the table, much faster than I could do it. It really works to the strength of the eye for detail. We've examined this eye for detail also with drawing tasks, and we've asked a young person, for example, we've shown them a picture of a house that we've drawn, and then we've said, can you draw a house like mine? And we just look at how they draw. And sometimes, unlike an ordinary child who will draw the outline first, a child with Asperger syndrome will start their drawing with a detail. You can see how the drawing progresses, I hope. Or they might draw part of it in fragments. So see how this young man drew the window. Instead of drawing the square of the frame and then just a simple cross to give the 4 panes of glass, he drew each one separately. But notice, in both drawings, the final house is a very nice drawing, and the configuration, the overall shape, is good. And you also sometimes see something like this. This is again from a young man on the autism spectrum, and he was drawing for us a house with 4 windows. And I hope you can see that this is a house with 4 windows. The house is at the bottom, and then there are 4 windows, and you can see the roof, and you can even see the chimney on top. He hasn't left anything out. It's only the configuration, it's how you put the parts together that is wrong. So we're increasingly thinking about eye for detail, weak coherence, as a cognitive style, so that all of us here would be somewhere on a continuum from weak coherence or attention to detail to strong coherence. And if you're the sort of person who leaves the cinema and you could tell somebody the story of what happened, but you can't remember any of the names, then perhaps you have strong coherence. If you're the sort of person who's very good at spotting mistakes in printed text or remembering details, but sometimes miss the big picture, maybe you're more on the strong coherence end. And we've found, too, that among the relatives of children with autism, and particularly the fathers of boys with high-functioning autism and Asperger syndrome, this eye for detail is very, very common. They do very well. About a third of the fathers, half the fathers and a third of the mothers will be exceptionally good at embedded figures that I showed you, and will show a number of other skills to do with detail focus. And you see it in the mothers too. And this again emphasizes to us that this part of autism that is not about social processing is separate from the social difficulties, because these fathers who are detail focused are not necessarily the same fathers who might say of themselves, I can understand my son finding interaction difficult because I hate being in crowds and I never could get on with a lot of people at once. Those are different fathers. We see these combinations, these aspects of autism and Asperger syndrome coming from different relatives, with maybe the mother who is detail-focused, a father or a great-uncle who has social difficulties, as if these different parts have to come together to make the full picture that is autism or Asperger syndrome. And we think that the eye for detail is a bias. It's not that most people with Asperger syndrome can't see the big picture. It's that their natural tendency is to focus on details. The analogy for us might be that neurotypicals can learn meaningless details, like the PIN number for your bank card, or if you're doing an exam at school and you really don't understand chemistry, but you can memorize the formula just for that exam, and then it's gone from your mind. But we don't choose to do these things unless we have to. These things are difficult for us. And the big picture memory and attention is easy for us. And for people with Asperger's syndrome, it's the other way around. The details are easy. Pulling back and seeing the big picture is difficult, but they can do it. They can do it. I want to acknowledge that there are several other very good theories that are also trying to address and understand why people on the autism spectrum are good at processing details. Among these are Laurent Montron's work, Kate Place's work, and Simon Baron-Cohen's idea of systemizing, that people on the autism spectrum are driven to try and work out typically physical systems. And I want to just say a little bit about our latest work, because we're trying to separate out whether people with Asperger's syndrome are so good at local processing that they don't bother with global processing, or is it that they can't very easily do big picture processing and so they're driven to be local. You could be good at embedded figures for either reason, because you don't get distracted by the whole, or because you're good at seeing the parts. So we've been giving tasks like recognizing fragmented figures. You can see here consecutive frames that we would show during a test. You start off by showing just a little bit of the picture, and you fill it in gradually. And you ask the person who's being assessed, tell me when you know what it is. And you just look at how easy it is for the person to pull together the information. It's important that you make sure there are no details that on their own could tell you what it is. If you had a picture of an elephant emerging and you left the tusks or the trunk, if they just saw that part, they might guess what it is. We want to test the ability to put information together. And it turns out that this is difficult for people with high-functioning autism and Asperger's syndrome. They need to see more of the picture before they can tell what it is. We've asked people with Asperger's syndrome to judge whether a figure like that is possible or impossible, meaning, is this something you could physically make? Does it work? Does it all connect up physically to be possible? And the interesting thing about this task is that all of the individual details, if you look at any of the points, any of the joins, they all make sense. They're all physically possible. But if you trace around the figure and look at it globally, you can see that it doesn't actually all fit together into a possible object. So you need to look at it globally to do that. And again, you can see that in terms of the ability to judge if something is possible or impossible, people, intelligent people with autism spectrum disorders, Asperger's syndrome, are doing less well than controls who have the same IQ level and the same age. You can also see that in this case, there are slightly different trajectories for typically developing males and females. I think I'll skip that for time. So, I don't know why this is coming up in this funny way. Okay. So our work has suggested that there may be real difficulties in seeing the big picture, as well as superior ability to see and remember details in autism spectrum disorders and Asperger's syndrome. We're not clear what the developmental relationship between those two is. Is it that the child is born very able to see details and so doesn't practice seeing the big picture? Or is it that the child has difficulty seeing the big picture and so becomes an expert in details? But we're encouraged by the fact that if these two abilities are rather separate, we may be able to improve the ability to see the big picture without taking away that very special Asperger ability to see and remember details. Because seeing and remembering details seems to be core to some of the amazing abilities that people on the autism spectrum have. So, for example, many people with Asperger's syndrome, not just those who play musical instruments, in fact have the capacity for perfect pitch. If you play them a note and give them a name or a picture to go with that note, and then test them a day, a week later, they'll remember which note goes with which picture. We can't do that. The memory of the note doesn't set in our minds unless you have perfect pitch. And in ordinary people, if you haven't acquired perfect pitch by the age of about 4 or 6, you're probably not going to acquire it. But it seems that in autism and Asperger syndrome, you kind of not practice this all your life. We can present you with notes and note labels as an adult, and you will learn it. So something that I'll return to is the fact that there isn't evidence yet, but I would be I very much believe that the period of plasticity in the brain, the time over which the brain can learn and acquire new skills, is really elongated in autism and Asperger syndrome, that there's real lifelong learning at a rate that the rest of us really don't continue to be able to do. We all know that for us, there are all sorts of skills you have to learn as a child. I think that's not true for people on the autism spectrum. They can learn all sorts of things very well as adults. So music, the ability to remember a specific note and not just a melody, is an advantage for musical skill. In art, we often see that the individuals who draw beautifully draw with amazing detail, and sometimes from detail to detail, rather than sketching in the whole. And the ability in mathematics often begins with a fascination with very specific and small details of number. And I want to emphasize that although we often say that autism spectrum difficulties involve problems of imagination, in the sense of pretend play, we don't have to believe at all that there's a problem of creativity. As you can see here in Monet's wonderful haystacks, being repetitive doesn't mean that you're not creative. And many people with Asperger syndrome can be extremely creative within their own repetitive interests if we give them some help, perhaps with their stickiness of attention. And indeed, again, I'll go over this for speed, we've found that ordinary individuals in the general population who are rated, these are 8-year-olds, who are rated by their parents as showing special abilities that are superior to children even much older than them, are also rated by their parents as showing more autistic-like traits or Asperger-like traits. This isn't having a clinical level problem, but they're more often rated as showing some social difficulties, some communication problems, and rigid and repetitive interests, and in particular, an eye for detail. So by looking at twins, we also have a suggestion in our data that some of the genetic influences that are involved in that eye for detail, in that rigid personality trait, are the same genes that are involved in contributing to the likelihood of having a special talent in maths or music or art or in memory. So what has all this led to? Well, we're at the phase now where we really want to take the idea of detail-focused psychological style and create some kinds of interventions and make it have real practical application. But it's made me think very differently about what the person with Asperger syndrome sees when they look out into the world, as Amy talked about so evocatively. But not only that they're not seeing the socially salient stimuli that we're seeing, but also that they are noticing and being fascinated by all sorts of details that we would completely miss. And you may have had this experience that you look at a picture with a school child with Asperger syndrome, you're looking at the same picture. Maybe it's a fairground scene, lots of people and lots of action. And you say, oh, no, what's this a picture of? And they might say, buttons, because they've noticed the buttons on the clothes of one particular small character. And for them, that's what that whole picture is, because that's what's captured their interest and attention. And certainly, with very young children with autism, you can easily make the mistake of trying to teach them words for things. You might have a picture there of a cow, and you point to it, but you're a good teacher, so you know pointing isn't easy, and you put your finger on the picture and say, look, this is a cow. But your finger happens to land on the tail. And now the young person thinks that cow is the word for tail, because they're not looking at the whole picture. So again, you need to trace around the whole thing. If you want them to see it, you have to tell them to see the whole thing. And we know from our research too that if you ask a person with Asperger's syndrome, with autism, high-functioning autism, to read something, if you mean that you want them to read it for meaning, you have to tell them, because otherwise they may well read it like a list of unconnected words, almost as if it was just a shopping list or a random list of words. They can read for meaning, but it's not automatic that they would want to or expect to do that. And we think that we can teach the ability to zoom out, maybe using the analogy with a video camera that can close up on tiny details but can also zoom out. And how sometimes, if you're in close-up, you can be misled. You might not know what you're looking at because as you zoom out, the picture is actually not what you're expecting. So we think that we can work with that. And I'm encouraged by the fact that adults with Asperger's syndrome that I know have told me that in their opinion, in their experience, it's become easier to see the big picture as they've got older. And I also think that seeing the bigger picture is important in managing problems in sensory and perceptual difficulties. So just very briefly, just as each part of the triad, I think, is best explained by separate cognitive accounts, so different parts of the triad seem to have different neural and brain underpinnings. So I've been involved in brain imaging work that's looked at what parts of the brain ordinary people use when they're reading other minds. We've used cartoons like this while somebody's lying in the scanner because we hope that when you look at a cartoon like this, you find yourself automatically thinking about what the bird doesn't know or what the snake wants the mice to think. And we compare with control cartoons where, again, you have to make inferences, but they're not about what somebody's thinking. And comparing the brain activity during these two different sorts of stimuli, you can see a network of brain regions that seem to be active, especially when you are reading somebody else's mind, when a neurotypical person is reading somebody else's mind. And these are the medial frontal cortex, temporoparietal junction, and areas around the amygdala. And it seems that these areas are not as active in people, even with very high-functioning Asperger's syndrome, who can pass our simple kinds of tests. If we ask them to explain the cartoons, they can do it. But they're not using the same automatic brain network. And this seems to map on to some of our structural brain findings that suggest decreased grey matter volume in just the same areas. It's interesting that similar brain regions have been shown to be active when ordinary volunteers think about and reflect on their own inner states. So this again suggests a similar mechanism for self-reflection and for reading other people's minds. And this is a nice diagram from a paper by Chris Frith showing how the mentalizing, reading other minds' tasks in red squares are in areas interspersed with monitoring your own inner states, shown here with the yellow circles. Other people's work has suggested rather different areas of brain activity important for executive functions, like switching and being flexible, and different areas, again, that are involved in looking at wholes and seeing parts within wholes. The brain basis of detail focus, or problems in seeing the big picture, is interesting, I think, but still by no means established. Traditionally, there's been a simplistic dichotomy between the right hemisphere doing all the sort of big picture integrative functions and the left hemisphere being more detail-focused and analytic. But that is a huge oversimplification of the great complexity of the beautiful thing inside our skulls. And in Asperger's syndrome, we know that there isn't a whole in the head. It's going to be about how the whole brain works together. And increasingly, people are interested in functional connectivity. It was mentioned earlier that the growth of the brain seems to be different in many people on the autism spectrum, with larger head size and brain volume occurring in the first few years, so being born with normal head size, but by the age of about 4, having larger heads and larger brains. One suggestion has been that this reflects a lack of synaptic pruning, that all that spaghetti we saw in Ami's nice slide doesn't get cut back to leave just the connections that are important. And computer models have suggested that if you have too many processing units, what you get is a lack of generalization. Instead, the brain is remembering every example that it sees instead of making a prototype. If you've heard Temple Grandin talk, she often says that if you mention a cat, she can't think about a cat. She thinks instantly of every cat she's ever seen. She brings up all those examples from her filing system. And that's the sort of thing you might get if you had too many processing units. And there's been the suggestion that perhaps the brain is wired up differently so that local connections in the brain are stronger and long-range connections are weaker. And this is yet to be proved, but it would fit well with the idea of a preference for processing information for details rather than for the bigger picture. So to finish up, what are the obstacles for people with Asperger's syndrome? Clearly, as Rita said, the problem is a problem of translation between two different worlds. The problem isn't with the person with Asperger's syndrome. What neurotypicals like us do and say and value often seems nonsensical to those with Asperger's syndrome. So, again, I think it was Roz Blackburn who was saying that when she had a job in a florist's shop, she could never understand when she came into work and the people that she worked with, the neurotypical people that she worked with, one of them would say to the other, "Did you see the football match on TV last night?" And the other one would say, "Yes, I saw it, wasn't it great?" And then they would talk about it for an hour. And Roz would say, "But they both know that the other one saw it. What possible information are they giving each other? It's completely pointless." We do all sorts of things that deeply irritate people with Asperger's syndrome. And people with Asperger's syndrome do and say things that puzzle and upset us. And mutual misunderstanding leads to anxiety and frustration and low self-esteem and anger and all those other problems we've heard about today. Asperger's view was very much that the traits that he described were on a continuum with personality traits, and that there could be a good prognosis if there was understanding and if the individual could find the right niche. And Asperger emphasized that this puts us in a very responsible position to make a good outcome for these young people. And the quote at the bottom, I think, is still, all these years later, is a moving one. And he says, "This knowledge of the possibility for a good outcome determines our attitude towards complicated individuals of this and other types. And it also gives us the right and the duty to speak out for these children with the whole force of our personality." So Asperger's adults and children see the world in a very different way. We can't assume that their high intelligence means that they understand things that the rest of us have absorbed from the social world. Mind blindness is a major challenge to social integration, and problems of knowing your own mind are also a major challenge. Anxiety cannot be overestimated. Most people with Asperger's syndrome are anxious almost all the time. And they'll say to you, one young man said to me, "You know how you feel when you go into an exam, a really important exam. You know how you feel in your body and how tense you feel in your mind." He said, "I feel like that all the time if I'm around other people." You imagine how that would impair your learning ability. And the last point I want to make is that we are just beginning to be in the position to find out about the end of the life course in Asperger's syndrome. There are adults that have been diagnosed previously or coming for diagnosis now who are going to be elderly soon or maybe already are elderly, and we know nothing about their needs. And that's going to be a very urgent area for research, I think. But I really feel strongly that lifelong learning is evident, and that to complete an individual with Asperger's syndrome, complete their education at 18 or 19 is crazy, when we know that sometimes they may suddenly emerge with abilities we've been trying to teach them for years when they're 30 or when they're 40. And so if we can put in place opportunities for lifelong learning, I really believe that we'll see amazing progress. So I don't know if this cartoon will translate. The teacher is saying to this pupil, who's obviously just made a comment to him, the teacher is saying, I'm not filibustering, I'm teaching. And I'm sorry, filibustering is a very fancy English word that only an Asperger child would use. But it illustrates how difficult it is sometimes for teachers to accept the child with Asperger syndrome, who may know more than they know, as we saw in Rita's film, and how important it is that we propagate a culture of real understanding and respect for people with Asperger syndrome. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Francesca, por esta excelente y positiva conferencia. Vamos a tener 15 minutos para contestar a preguntas, ¿eh? Y mientras tanto, mientras llegan las preguntas, yo te quería preguntar, Francesca, basada en el estudio de gemelos que habéis realizado, en que las 3 dimensiones tienen estilos cognitivos diferentes, incluso parece que tienen etiologías diferentes, las clasificaciones actuales basadas en autismo, síndrome de Asperger, PDD, NOS, ¿tienen sentido o cuál es tu opinión? ¿Hacia qué tipo de clasificaciones nos deberíamos dirigir?
So this is a big question. For me, the work that we've done suggests that variation in social ability, variation in communication ability, and variation in rigid, repetitive behavior, that they are each of them quite highly heritable. They have a strong genetic component, but that the genes involved are mainly non-overlapping. There are some overlapping genetic effects, but mainly non-overlapping. It begins to explain why heterogeneity is so great in the autism spectrum. Because where you are in terms of your social ability doesn't predict where you are in terms of your rigid and repetitive or obsessive behavior. So we get every possible combination. What I don't think it means is that somehow the concept of autism or of Asperger syndrome is meaningless. Because clearly when you get all 3 areas of difficulty together, there is a very special quality that results. Apart from anything else, you strip away many lines of possible compensation. So if you have problems of being detail-focused or skills of being detail-focused, you're not going to be so good at working out what's going on socially from the context as you might be able to do otherwise. So I think it's still a very special constellation of features that come together. Whether we're dividing up the autism spectrum in the right way in terms of Asperger syndrome, I think that's a big debate, and I think it'll be handled ably by Amy Klin tomorrow. The diagnosis of PDD-NOS, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, is a big problem because it's just a bin to put anybody in that doesn't really fit. And it doesn't mean anything to another clinician, to a teacher, because you don't know if it means somebody who has all 3 parts of the triad, but in a fairly low level of problem, or whether they have 1 or 2 areas of difficulty but don't meet criteria on the 3rd. So I think that could really be much more informative as a category.
Tenemos una pregunta sobre el uso de test estandarizados para evaluar la teoría de mente. ¿Qué tipo de test tú recomiendas para la evaluación de teoría de mente?
Oh, gosh, I'm not the expert on early diagnosis at all, and I think I probably ought to put the question to one of the speakers I
think there was probably
was it a mistranslation?
A mistake in the translation.
Okay.
She's not asking for instrumentation for early diagnosis. The standardized instrumentation for measuring theory of mind.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay, sorry, the translation was wrong. Oh, for measuring theory of mind, yes. So I think now there is a good battery of tasks out there, and it really depends what level you're dealing with, what age group and what level of verbal ability. But there are, I think, now a good array of tasks, and they range all the way from simple things like a naturalistic penny hiding game, where the child just has to guess which hand you've got a penny hidden in, and then you give the child the penny and they have to do it for you, and you see that a young child will leave one hand open, for example. They don't know they have to hide the information from your mind, or they will do other things that tell you which hand the penny is in. All the way from that kind of task up to the animations that I showed you that are fairly good at finding some of the difficulties that can be hard to isolate in Asperger's syndrome. And Ami's work has many other measures that are excellent. So I think there are a number of tasks out there, and some of them have fairly good normative data, others not so much. But there are a range of things out there, and I'm very happy if anyone wants to contact me to have specific instruments.
Hay otra pregunta sobre el umbral del dolor y si realmente el umbral del dolor, que en algunos casos está aumentado en los trastornos del espectro autista, si tiene que ver algo también con el estilos cognitivos descritos.
So pain threshold and sensory abnormalities in general, I think, are still very poorly understood. I mean, there is a move now in the research to recognize that sensory problems might be very important and that they deserve research. And the report of either usually abnormally high pain thresholds, children who don't appear to feel pain. But on the other hand, you get children who you just brush against them by mistake and they go, ow, as if that hurts. So you can get it both ways round. Is this explained by cognitive accounts? I think it might be, in the sense that for all of us, for neurotypicals, how you experience a stimulus depends on your expectations and the context. So if you're not expecting a loud bang, then it's more likely to make you jump, it's more likely to be perceived as unpleasant and overly loud than if you're ready for it, or if it's in a context where you perceive it as enjoyable, like fireworks or something. So I think part of it may be about perceiving a stimulus in context. But it may be also, there may be real physiological reasons as well. I think we really need the research to find out.
Hay otra pregunta sobre qué técnicas se pueden utilizar para ayudarles a que capten el contexto más que el detalle. Técnicas terapéuticas.
Well, we really want to know what to do as well, and we want to try and do some studies to try out different sorts of ways. As I mentioned, I think with high-functioning individuals, it's always useful to use a concrete analogy. And you can give a person with Asperger's syndrome a video camera and let them see how they can zoom in on a tiny detail or zoom out. And you could show them, I think, for example, that if you give them a picture and you start off zoomed in and you ask them to guess what the picture is, that they might make a guess that's completely wrong because as they zoom out, they see that the bigger context changes the meaning of the detail. And that might convey to them that in some situations you need to zoom out. And then I think you need on top of that ways of making the young person recognize this is a big picture task or this is a small picture task. So use your zooming out or use your zooming in. But we're encouraged in believing that we could do some good with this because colleagues of ours at the Maudsley Hospital have taken our ideas about detail focus and applied them in a different area with women who have anorexia and other eating disorders. Now, I know that can happen along with autism spectrum, but these are young women who don't have other diagnoses. But they've found that many of their women with anorexia are very detail-focused. They're very good at the embedded figures test, although they're typically bad at other kinds of executive function tasks and other kinds of cognitive tests, especially when their weight is low. So they seem to be detail-focused. And our colleagues have found that even just talking to these women about the way that they look at the world in terms of details and helping them to recognize that that might be part of the sort of person that they are and why they're good at certain things, but also how it might bring some difficulties in addressing their issues about eating, they've actually had some very good results. So we're hopeful that we can turn this into something practical.
Hay otra pregunta sobre un poco lo que has comentado sobre la psicopatía. Si es posible dar un diagnóstico comórbido de psicopatía o trastorno de conducta disocial en un síndrome de Asperger, que parecen bastante incompatibles los dos diagnósticos.
So, I don't know about about diagnostic rules of trumping, but in terms of psychological cognitive theory and models and understanding the brain, it would be possible to have both conditions. So typically, an ordinary psychopath has good mind reading skills and always has had good mind reading skills, but they seem to have deficits, perhaps in the amygdala, that mean that whereas for you and I, from early ages, seeing somebody crying in distress is very unpleasant for us. We don't like it. It will stop us in our tracks. It will stop us from doing what we're doing. You can teach people not to stop, and that's what they teach soldiers to do, to keep on despite the fact that there is distress. But naturally, we stop when we see distress. People with psychopathy don't have that instinct to empathize. And it's possible, although I think it's very rare, but it's possible that somebody with Asperger's syndrome would also have the damage to the amygdala that meant that they didn't react to somebody else's distress. Most people with Asperger's syndrome do. Most people with Asperger's syndrome are empathic. They have difficulty in mind reading. But it would be possible to have psychopathy in addition, just by bad luck, in addition to Asperger's syndrome. And it would be important to spot that because you need a different kind of intervention then.
Muy bien. Y por último, hay una pregunta sobre la comorbilidad de síndrome de Asperger con el trastorno por déficit de atención y hiperactividad y si existe alguna explicación desde el punto de vista cognitivo para esta comorbilidad.
Okay. Yes, as Sarah mentioned, the overlap between ADHD and autism and Asperger's syndrome is complicated because the inattention part of ADHD may be rather different. I mean, most people on the autism spectrum and with Asperger's syndrome have attentional abnormalities. It may be that their attention is over-focused. But also, if there's not something in their special interest, they may be hard to engage. So their attention may seem abnormal. The fact that you can get Asperger's syndrome with hyperactivity or without hyperactivity suggests that there could also be a genuine comorbidity or co-occurrence of hyperactivity and Asperger's syndrome. In terms of cognitive accounts, we've mainly found contrasts between ADHD and Asperger's syndrome, and it was particularly important to us in some of our work to show that although both groups have executive function problems, and that may be part of the explanation for the co-occurrence, people with ADHD, despite their executive function problems, are not detail-focused, typically. That's not part of that syndrome. So having a problem in shifting attention isn't the explanation for why people with autism are detail-focused. It's not that they can't shift to being global. In any case, why aren't they stuck on being global if it's just a problem in shifting? But people had suggested, for example, that maybe they couldn't inhibit a local response. And we find that people with ADHD who can't inhibit the action are not detail-focused, so it's not a problem of inhibition. But maybe there are some common executive function problems that mean that having ADHD and autism is more likely than by chance alone. I hope that makes sense.
Muy bien. Bueno, pues terminamos. Muchísimas gracias a la profesora Francesca Happe.
Thank you.
Una cuestión de organización importante para que mañana estemos todos ya un poco más, no hagamos estos cambios de última hora.